All right, everyone, welcome back to our next lecture presentation. We have made it through the cardiovascular system and are finally getting a breath of fresh air with the lymphatic system and the immune system. The lymphatic system and the immune systems are two systems that we typically do describe together. However, they are two different systems that are just very closely associated. The lymphatic system is more of a structural system, while the immune system can be described as more of a functional system. The lymphatic system specifically is a second set of vessels that we have coursing through our body that are going to primarily be returning interstitial fluid back to the bloodstream. Along the pathway that this fluid takes to get back to the cardiovascular system, we filter this fluid through a set of lymph nodes, and there are other organs that play a major role with the lymphatic system as well. This is why we call it a structural system, because there are literal physical structures that facilitate the function of the system. The immune system, on the other hand, is a bit more conceptual. It's more of a functional system. The immune system doesn't have any specific organs that make it up. However, the immune system serves many different roles in the body, despite not having physical organs that make up the system. The immune system can be collectively thought about as a set of actions facilitated by different parts of our body that are all in the interest of defending our body against foreign invaders. Throughout this chapter, we will discuss both systems. However, we will attack the lymphatic system first and then make a transition into the immune system in the latter part of this chapter. As we start with the immune system, we'll talk a little bit about its function and then go into the structural components that make it up. As we transition into the immune system, we'll start to organize the immune system into its different branches and then talk about each branch's unique roles and how they serve the body. We will finish this chapter by discussing some homeostatic imbalances that relate to the immune system. So first and foremost, in terms of the lymphatic system, this is a structural system, as I've mentioned. We can actually dissect out lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes that make up this system. But the functions of the lymphatic system are quite notable and need to be mentioned before we start discussing all of the different structures that can be found in this system. So the lymphatic system has three major roles. The first of which is to drain interstitial fluid. The second of which, I'll jump down here and say, is to carry out immune responses. And then the third role is going to be the transportation of dietary fats, which we will talk the least about. But it is this action here that I want to elaborate on first. Interstitial fluid, as we know, is formed through the process of filtration. That is bulk flow from the previous chapter. As fluid leaks out of the capillaries, it's going to be left in the tissues. And as we get to our venous end, that fluid is going to be pulled back into the capillaries through reabsorption. However, not all of the interstitial fluid that leaks out of our capillaries makes its way back into the vessels by reabsorption. And this is where the lymphatic system comes in. All of that remaining interstitial fluid that didn't go back into the capillaries will be drained into the lymphatic vessels, get filtered, and then be returned back to the cardiovascular system. This is a major function of the lymphatic system. Without the maintenance role that the lymphatic system is playing here, we would end up losing about 3 liters of blood every single day to the interstitial fluid. So it is the lymphatic system in this first function that ensures that the homeostasis of our blood volume is maintained. That will be the first function of the lymphatic system that we want to keep in mind. The second function of the lymphatic system that I mentioned is that this is the location where immune responses are carried out. The pathway laid out by the lymphatic system is a second set of vessels that will eventually dump back into the cardiovascular system. Realistically, this is a potential threat for foreign invaders to make their way into our bloodstream and affect us. So thanks to the protective measures and lymphatic organs that are along the way, we have a very strong ability to defend against different pathogens that are trying to make their way into the bloodstream through the lymphatic system. Specifically, it is the lymph nodes that are going to filter out lymphatic fluid and be the primary locations of immune responses. There are some other locations that immune responses will be carried out. However, when we think of the lymphatic system, it is typically the lymph nodes that come to mind. I will discuss all of the secondary lymphatic organs that carry out immune responses shortly. The transportation of dietary fats is a third function of the lymphatic system that we will actually focus on a little bit more in the digestive chapter. I'm not going to elaborate much more on this function in this chapter, but in future chapters to come I will. That being said, I do want to give you a little bit of background about what this function is and why we have it. Specifically, in the digestive system, there are tiny lymphatic vessels that are closely associated with the digestive organs. These lymphatic vessels are called lacteals, and they will allow for taking fats out of the digestive system and bringing them back into the circulatory system. So I just wanted to make sure that you had some background on this, but it's these two functions that we're primarily going to be focusing on in this chapter. So one thing that we already know from the last chapter is that hydrostatic pressure in the blood is going to force fluid out of the capillaries, and this fluid that leaks out is what becomes the interstitial fluid. As we make our way back to the venous drainage, the hydrostatic pressure of blood is going to decrease, and the colloid osmotic pressure of blood will then become greater than the hydrostatic pressure. Therefore, we have reabsorption of that fluid at the venous end, where we can restore some of that lost blood volume. However, there is a little bit of fluid that remains as part of the interstitial fluid, and it is this interstitial fluid that, if not returned back to the blood, will severely decrease our existing blood volume by a rate of 3 liters per day. If this interstitial fluid is not brought back into our blood vessels through the lymphatic system, we will end up with too much fluid inside of our tissues and not enough fluid in our blood. If our blood volume significantly decreases, we'll then lose the adequate amount of blood pressure to perfuse the rest of our body tissues. And at the same time, the interstitial fluid that's building up inside of the tissues would lead to edema, which is the swelling of body tissues. So to prevent a drop in blood pressure, and also to prevent edema, the lymphatic system is present to return all of that lost interstitial fluid back into the cardiovascular system. So now that we know a major function of the lymphatic system and a little bit about how this system works, we need to elaborate on the structural components that make up this system and facilitate that passage of interstitial fluid back into the blood vessels. So you can see from this slide that there's a very intricate network of lymphatic vessels coursing throughout our body. Some of the components of the lymphatic system include our primary lymphatic organs, such as our bone marrow and the thymus, our secondary lymphatic organs, which include the spleen, lymph nodes, and other lymphatic tissue, as well as our lymphatic vessels that are going to hold lymph. Lymph is the name for the fluid that has entered into the lymphatic vessels and will eventually be filtered and brought back to the cardiovascular system. We'll find that in some of these lymphatic structures, we will house immune cells, such as lymphocytes and other phagocytes. These cells will be set up to destroy any type of foreign pathogen that has made its way into the lymphatic system. One of the facts about the lymphatic system that's very important to note is that all of our lymphatic fluid is filtered before it goes back into the bloodstream. We need to make sure that our blood is pure and doesn't contain anything dangerous that's going to be passed throughout our bodies. So we will pass all of our lymphatic fluid through a series of many different lymph nodes. Lymph nodes containing lymphocytes and other phagocytes will filter out all of the bad things and return that now pure lymphatic fluid back into the circulatory system. I have added this picture in here just to real quickly show you how the lymphatic vessels will go through many different lymph nodes as they make their way back up to the blood vessels up here in the thoracic region. You'll see that these lymphatic vessels will flow through lymph nodes that will eventually sprout other vessels that will lead into other lymph nodes. And essentially, as this lymphatic fluid passes back through our lymph nodes, it will be filtered multiple times as it makes its way back up to these thoracic veins, where lymph will enter back into our blood vessels. I encourage you to use this picture as a reference as you learn more about the structure of the lymphatic system. Now on this slide, what we see are the individual components of the lymphatic system. The vasculature of the lymphatic system is a little bit different than our cardiovascular system. With the cardiovascular system, we saw that large arteries became smaller and smaller and smaller and eventually flowed into capillaries, which were the smallest of all vessels. They were 1 cell layer thick. And then those capillaries allowed blood to flow into venules, which allowed blood to flow back into veins, and veins get larger and larger as they go back to the heart. The lymphatic system does have some similarities. However, overall, it is much, much different than our cardiovascular system is. The lymphatic system more so represents our venous drainage. Lymphatic capillaries are quite different than our systemic or pulmonary capillaries are. Lymphatic capillaries can be described as blind lymphatic capillaries, which means that they are closed on one end. So there's no large opening for fluid to enter into our lymphatic capillaries. They're closed on one end, and substances will diffuse through the intercellular clefts into our lymphatic vessels. These blind lymphatic capillaries are going to be weaving in and out of our true capillaries, as they must be closely associated to those capillaries to absorb any extra interstitial fluid that has not been reabsorbed into the bloodstream. Blind lymphatic capillaries will eventually merge and get larger and larger to form what are known as lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels more so represent veins. They have very thin walls with a large lumen, and they'll often have valves to prevent backflow, just like our veins did also. Many different lymphatic vessels will converge at lymph nodes. There are roughly 600 lymph nodes that can be found in the body, and they will filter the lymph that's coming from our lymphatic vessels flowing into them. Each lymph node will filter their lymphatic fluid, and that will allow for the passage of substances out of that lymph node into other lymphatic vessels to get filtered through additional other lymph nodes. And as this process proceeds and we get closer and closer to returning this fluid back into the cardiovascular system, those lymphatic vessels will eventually continue to merge and form lymphatic trunks, which are much, much larger lymphatic vessels. And then lymphatic trunks will continue to merge to eventually form the two major lymphatic ducts. There are two specific lymphatic ducts, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Lymphatic ducts are the largest of the lymphatic vessels that we will find, and it is these two ducts that will dump back in to our subclavian veins. So let's take a second to elaborate on a couple of these components and walk through this pathway of the lymphatic system once more. So as I have mentioned, blood plasma is going to eventually get filtered out of the capillaries and become interstitial fluid. It's going to get picked up by the lymphatic capillaries, those blind lymphatic capillaries, and just keep in mind that this network is going to be interwoven with our systemic capillaries. These lymphatic capillaries are going to merge into larger and larger lymphatic vessels, which will take lymph to lymph nodes to be filtered. Many different lymph nodes will filter out our lymphatic fluid, and then eventually, after our lymphatic fluid has been nicely filtered, it's going to flow back into the lymphatic trunks, and then lymphatic trunks are going to flow into lymphatic ducts. These are the largest of all of the lymphatic vessels, namely the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct, which we will talk about shortly. Both of these ducts will dump into the subclavian veins, and this will allow lymph to rejoin the cardiovascular system and get sent back out into the tissues as blood plasma to repeat this cycle. So just to reiterate a couple of points and highlight a few things in red for you all, the lymphatic capillaries can be called blind because they are closed on one end. These blind lymphatic capillaries are very closely associated with the capillaries of our systemic circulation. These will form into lymphatic vessels. Our lymphatic vessels are going to have very, very thin walls, much like veins, and they'll also have valves to prevent backflow, since there is no pump directly pushing the lymph through the lymphatic capillaries. Many vessels will take that lymph through many lymph nodes, which will eventually eject other vessels that will come together to form lymphatic trunks, and the lymphatic trunks will come together to form our two ducts, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. So everything that we've mentioned on the last slide is pretty much on this slide also. Now I did want to take a quick second to just elaborate on this picture down here to show you how fluid gets into these blind lymphatic capillaries. If our capillaries are closed on one end, I think it's noteworthy to mention how fluid gets into that closed end. So the endothelial cells of our blind lymphatic capillaries are specifically positioned so that their ends are barely touching each other. When pressure in the tissue is higher than that of the lymphatic capillary, those endothelial cells will open up their intercellular clefts and allow fluid to go into the lymphatic capillary. But as fluid continually makes its way into the lymphatic capillaries, the pressure in here is going to become greater than it is in the tissues. And this will force the endothelial cells closed so that no fluid makes its way out of the lymphatic capillaries back into the tissues. Once lymph has made its way into the lymphatic capillaries, it's going to follow the pathway back up to eventually it gets to our two lymphatic ducts. This is the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Now I want you to be aware of these two lymphatic ducts because these are the largest vessels that can be found as part of the lymphatic system. These will eventually dump into the subclavian veins. Specifically, the right lymphatic duct will dump into our right subclavian vein, and our thoracic duct is going to dump into the left subclavian vein. A very important association that I want you all to make. One thing that you can see here on the right side of the slide is the parts of the body that are drained by the thoracic duct and the other parts of the body that are drained by the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct is the larger of the two, and it will actually drain 3/4 of all of the lymphatic fluid in our body. Specifically, it drains the entire bottom half and the top left half of the body as well, while the right lymphatic duct will only drain the upper right quarter of our body. I would definitely like you to feel comfortable with which areas receive lymph from which ducts. Now, at this point, we've spoken extensively about the vascular structure of the lymphatic system. However, we haven't mentioned as much about the primary and secondary lymphatic organs and tissues. These are other structural components of the lymphatic system that will also aid in the response of our immune system. Primary lymphatic organs can be described as the places where our immune cells become what's known as immunocompetent. Immunocompetent means that our cells are able to deal with immune reactions properly. There are two characteristics of immunocompetency that we need to keep in mind. First and foremost, our immune cells need to be able to attack foreign substances. They need to be able to recognize things that are not us and destroy those things that are trying to invade our body. But the second thing that's required for immunocompetence is that on top of attacking and destroying other foreign particles, our immune cells need to be able to recognize self-antigens, what makes up our own body, and not attack those things. A cell that's unable to attack foreign substances is virtually useless. However, a cell that is able to attack foreign substances but can't distinguish non-self substances from self substances is just as bad, if not worse. So it is in these primary lymphatic organs and tissues that we will have our immune cells being produced and becoming what's known as educated. So we'll go ahead and start by mentioning the red bone marrow. This is a type of lymphatic tissue because it doesn't have a connective tissue capsule. That's the difference between an organ and a tissue. Organs will have a connective tissue capsule, while tissues will not. Red bone marrow is something that we've already discussed a few chapters ago when we talked about blood. Specifically, in the red bone marrow, we'll find the pluripotent stem cell giving rise to all of our different types of blood cells. We had the myeloid cell lineage and the lymphoid cell lineage. And it is the lymphoid cell lineage that gives rise to our T lymphocytes, our B lymphocytes, and our NK cells, which are going to be the three major cells of focus in this presentation. The red bone marrow is producing these immune cells, and some of them, such as the B cells, will become immunocompetent in the red bone marrow and be released when matured. However, the T cells work a little different. They will get released as immature T cells coming from the red bone marrow, and they'll have to migrate over to the thymus. The thymus was one of our endocrine organs that sat in the mediastinum above the heart and between the two lungs. The thymus has a couple hormones that it releases to help in the process of the education of T cells. So specifically, this is the site where T cells will eventually mature. Thanks to the two hormones, thymosin and thymopoietins, this is going to help along this process of T cell maturation. Now, the thymus is typically more active in childhood. It is during childhood that our immune system is developing, and so therefore we will see the thymus very active in our younger years. But as we get older, there will be infiltrations of adipose tissue, and the thymus is not going to be as active as it once was. So keep in mind that all of our lymphocytes are produced in the red bone marrow, but it is the T cells that will eventually come over here to the thymus to be educated. This is where they'll learn to be immunocompetent and learn how to distinguish between self and non-self. So we just saw that it was the primary lymphatic organs and tissues, which is where our immune cells become immunocompetent. But now we look at the secondary lymphatic organs and tissues, and these will be places that have different functions. Specifically, secondary lymphatic organs can be described as the places where the majority of our immune responses will take place. The examples of our secondary lymphatic organs and tissues are lymph nodes, the spleen, and our lymphatic nodules. We want to keep in mind the difference between a secondary lymphatic organ and a tissue. Organs will have a connective tissue capsule, while tissues will not. So it is the lymph nodes and the spleen which will contain that connective tissue capsule, and the lymphatic nodules that will not. This will be considered a type of lymphatic tissue. And there are two types of lymphatic nodules, namely the tonsils and the Peyer's patches, which I'll elaborate on shortly. First and foremost, we want to introduce the lymph node. Now, there are roughly 600 lymph nodes that can be found in the body, and they do vary in their size, but they're roughly the size of a gumball. Lymph nodes are going to be places that will house lots and lots of immune cells. We've now talked about how our blind lymphatic capillaries will allow for lymph to flow into lymphatic vessels, but that lymph will eventually get pushed through a whole bunch of lymph nodes. And it is in the lymph node that we will see this lymph being filtered. Some of the cells that exist inside of a lymph node are B cells, T cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. There are some others that can be found inside of the lymph nodes as well, but these are the major ones that we'll see. These cells exist inside of the lymph nodes, and along with the reticular connective tissue that's making up the structure of the lymph nodes, these filters will filter the lymph coming in. Essentially, lymph nodes allow our own cells to ambush any type of foreign invader that thinks it's quite clever trying to sneak into the cardiovascular system through our lymphatic vessels. You'll also see in this picture a section of a lymphatic vessel with a valve, and this is just to remind you that this system will have valves to prevent that backflow from going back into the capillary beds. Now, one very unique characteristic of lymph nodes that you may have already noticed is that there are quite a bit more afferent vessels than efferent vessels. Just in case we don't remember the definition of the terms afferent versus efferent lymphatic vessels will take lymph to the lymph nodes, while efferent vessels will take fluid away from the vessels. Afferent and efferent can be remembered as the A stands for arrival and the E stands for exit. So what we see with our lymph node is that there are more afferent vessels coming into the convex side of our lymph node, and there are fewer efferent vessels that are leaving. One thing that we know about the flow of fluids is that if more fluid is coming into the lymph node and fewer vessels are allowing for that fluid to leave, the flow through lymph nodes is going to be quite slow. And that's what we see shown here. Lymph flow through the lymph nodes is going to be quite slow. And this is actually quite a necessary characteristic of our lymph nodes, as this gives our immune cells time to break down the pathogens that are trying to enter the lymph nodes. So we will see that we have more afferent vessels than efferent vessels, and that slows the flow of lymph through every lymph node. You'll see that this side of the lymph node is convex, and this side indents, sort of like a kidney bean. It is this area that's called the hilus, and lots of organs do have a hilus, such as the kidneys as well as the lungs. We will go over those organs in other lecture videos, but the hilus is specifically the place on certain organs where vessels will enter and leave. So the efferent vessels specifically on our lymph nodes will exit at the hilus. We also want to remember that the terms afferent and efferent are quite relative to the lymph node that we're talking about. Eventually, there will be a downstream lymph node as all of our lymphatic fluid gets filtered more than once. And these efferent vessels will become afferent vessels when we're looking at the reference frame of the next lymph node that will receive flow from these vessels. So again, a couple points to really keep in mind: that the flow through our lymph nodes is much slower. This is caused in part because of the additional afferent vessels that we have and fewer efferent vessels allowing flow out of our lymph node. This gives more time for our lymphocytes and our macrophages to break down any pathogens that have come into the lymph node. And we also want to remember that there's always several nodes that our lymph flows through before that fluid is going to enter back into the cardiovascular system. We now know that it is our lymph nodes that actually are the players that filter lymphatic fluid. These are the only players that will filter lymphatic fluid. And filtering can be described as the removal of substances by our own immune cells. We do typically tend to have clusters of lymph nodes in certain areas in the body. Specifically in the inguinal, the axillary, and in the cervical regions, we'll have lots and lots of clusters of lymph nodes. This indicates that these areas are locations where there's lots of filtration going on. While our macrophages are filtering out the lymph, our lymphocytes are going to be experiencing different antigens in our lymph nodes and becoming active. Lymphocytes are going to be the big players of this chapter as we talk about our immune system. So I wanted to take just a quick second to review a couple of the major points that I want you to be aware of regarding lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, being a secondary lymphatic organ, will contain a connective tissue capsule. By definition, as an organ, they will have this connective tissue capsule. We've already mentioned that there are more afferent vessels than efferent vessels, and this gives us the ability to slow flow through the lymph node and give our immune cells more time to deal with foreign invaders. We also want to remember that all of our lymph gets filtered more than once through many different lymph nodes. Not only are our immune systems filtering out and removing foreign substances, but reticular fibers will also aid in this process as well. We'll have lots of different types of cells in our lymph nodes, especially the macrophages and lymphocytes that we mentioned, but we'll also find B cells and dendritic cells in our lymph nodes also. So I've highlighted quite a bit in red. I really want you to focus on the major points that I have elaborated upon. A homeostatic imbalance related to this particular secondary lymphatic organ is caused by overwhelming numbers of bacterial and virus particles that have assumed position inside of one of the lymph nodes. We call swollen lymph nodes buboes, and they get their name because this is what would often occur with the bubonic plague. Due to increased numbers of pathogenic particles in a lymph node, our own immune cells can become overwhelmed and overrun by these dangerous invaders. And therefore, we're mounting a full immune response in that lymph node. With the immune response comes inflammation, pain, and swelling. To meet the danger caused by these different pathogenic particles, our own immune cells will proliferate and fill up this area to try to overwhelm them back. This is what leads to the swelling in our lymph nodes. One other thing that we want to be cautious with our lymph nodes about is cancer. Cancer cells are sometimes able to make their way into the lymphatics, and if they're able to evade the immune system, that can lead to metastasis when they enter back into the bloodstream. It's very likely that you or someone you know has had a swollen lymph node before. The next secondary lymphatic organ that we're going to mention is the spleen. The spleen can specifically be found in the left hypochondriac region of our abdominopelvic regions. This is going quite a ways back to ANP1. If we draw tic-tac-toe on the abdomen, we'll see that in the center we have the umbilical region, and just above that we have our epigastric region. To either side of the epigastric regions will be our right and left hypochondriac regions, and the spleen can be found just in there, tucked under the diaphragm, which we can see in this picture. The spleen is quite unique from the lymph nodes, as the spleen is not filtering lymph. It's actually going to be filtering our blood. Any type of bad substances or pathogens that have entered the blood will be removed by the spleen. Anything that has evaded the lymphatic system might get pumped back out to the spleen, and the spleen will be able to deal with it in the blood. The spleen does have a couple different functions that we will see listed here. First and foremost, on top of filtering out bacteria and viruses from the blood, the spleen will also play a big role in breaking down old red blood cells. Any red blood cells that are no longer functional or have issues associated with them will get destroyed by the spleen. We will find that the spleen does play a role in production of red blood cells while the fetus is growing. However, more importantly, another function we have with the spleen is that the spleen is a major player in storing platelets and serving as another blood reservoir. At any given time, the spleen is storing about 1/3 of all of the platelets in our bloodstream. And so if we are hemorrhaging, we can access the blood in the spleen and use those platelets to clot blood to prevent further loss of blood. Any type of ectomy is the removal of something, so a splenectomy is the removal of the spleen. We'll also come to see that we'll have a tonsillectomy, and that will be the removal of one of the tonsils. The spleen was our secondary lymphatic organ. Now we're going to talk about our one lymphatic tissue, the lymphatic nodules. Lymphatic nodules are not surrounded by a connective tissue capsule, and that's what indicates that they are tissues, not organs. Lymphatic nodules are typically found in the mucosa, and therefore they get the name mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. As we hopefully remember, mucous membranes will line the inside of open cavities, such as the digestive system and the respiratory system. Mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue can be found scattered throughout the mucosa, and it serves a protective function for pathogens that have entered that open cavity. Even though we generally consider the respiratory system and the digestive system as nestled far deep within the body, they are still open cavities, as they are both connected to the external environment through the mouth. We'll also find mucous membranes in the urinary tract and the respiratory system as well. Some specific masses of malt that we will see in the body are the tonsils and the Peyer's patches. Tonsils specifically can be found in the back of the throat. There are 5 tonsils, and these will make sure that any dangerous substances trying to enter from the digestive system or the respiratory system are stopped before they go down the throat. Itis is inflammation, so tonsillitis is an inflammation of the tonsils due to an increased amount of bacteria. This doesn't just have to be increased bacteria, this could also be increased viral particles or other foreign pathogens as well. The Peyer's patches are much less discussed than the tonsils. It's likely you've heard of the tonsils before, but I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't heard of the Peyer's patches. These are going to be found in the walls to the last part of the small intestine. The small intestine has 3 different parts. The first part, which is known as the duodenum, the second part, which is known as the jejunum, and the third part, which is known as the ileum. And it is the ileum of the small intestine that will contain these Peyer's patches, as we find the small intestine as a major location for absorption. This is another prime place that pathogens will be able to enter our bloodstream. So by having Peyer's patches in this location, this prevents absorption of these particles because they'll get destroyed in the Peyer's patches instead. So generally, in places that we will have potential access points for pathogens to invade our body, we will have some type of lymphatic tissue that is present to stop any entry of foreign substances. Another fascinating condition that is related to our lymphatic system is known as elephantiasis. Elephantiasis is a condition that is caused by parasitic roundworms infecting the lymphatic system. This condition is transmitted by mosquitoes. It's very common in countries such as India, where there is a lot of stagnant water and mosquitoes are able to proliferate. When a mosquito lands and accesses the bloodstream of its host, the larvae of these parasitic worms will enter into the bloodstream. They will eventually get filtered out of the capillaries and collected in the lymphatic system, where they will continue to grow for months. Eventually, when these worms get big enough, they can clog the lymphatic vessels, and therefore we have the buildup of the interstitial fluid in one part of our body. This is typically localized to one location on the body. It's often found in one of the lower limbs, but it's also often seen in the testicles as well. This is a very debilitating condition. However, with taking antiparasitic drugs, we can destroy the roundworms, and then to treat the edema that's left over, we can wrap the leg, and that will squeeze that interstitial fluid back up to the kidneys for excretion. One clinical term I want to share with you to finish up the lymphatic system are lymphomas. Lymphomas refer to cancers of the lymphatic organs. These will often occur in the lymph nodes. The 2 types of lymphoma are non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and Hodgkin's disease. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma does occur in all age groups. However, it is very common in young people also. Roughly about half of all of the individuals that get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma are able to be treated and survive for a good period of time after the condition. Hodgkin's disease, on the other hand, typically affects individuals between the ages of 15 and 35, and also people over the age of 60. This has a much better cure rate of 90 to 95%. While these are the 2 types of lymphoma, I really want you to be able to define what lymphoma is by its name. Oma means tumor, and tumors lead to cancers. So lymphoma, of course, is a tumor or cancer of the lymphoid tissue. Now, another term that we will see that's very, very important is what's referred to as our sentinel node. The sentinel node can be described as the first lymph node that is receiving drainage of lymphatic fluid from an area that is suspected of cancer. Typically, we can utilize the sentinel node to determine whether or not a cancer has metastasized into the lymphatic tissue. By taking the sentinel node and doing a biopsy of it, we can check that lymph node for cancerous cells. If there's no cancerous cells present, we can conclude that there's likely not been a metastasis. However, if cancer cells have invaded into the sentinel node, we need to continue to work our way upstream to determine the progression of the metastasis of the cancer. So these are just a couple questions to assess your understanding of the lymphatic system. The first question, which of the following substances filter lymph? We know that only one structure is going to filter lymph, so it's not going to be all the above. And spleen, we've already discussed, is going to filter the blood, so it can't be spleen either. Lymphatic vessels will only transport lymph, so therefore lymph nodes is going to be our correct answer for this question. Our second question, filtered lymph is returned to the blood where? Lymph that has been filtered will dump into the lymphatic trunks and eventually into the two lymphatic ducts, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Both of those two ducts will dump into our subclavian veins, and that's how lymph makes its way back to the cardiovascular system.